It is the 7th of September 1998. A doctor and his lawyer arrive for questioning at a police station on the outskirts of Manchester in northern England. Within minutes, the police press charges against the doctor based on a case which they have been building for several weeks. It all began with the sudden death of Kathleen Grundy on the 24th of June 1998. Although she was an elderly woman, Kathleen Grundy was in good health. However, an autopsy has revealed excessive levels of powerful opiates in her system, prompting a police investigation into the doctor whose care she was under. However, it soon becomes clear that this is not an isolated case as, to their horror, the police realize that dozens and even hundreds of people have died in similar circumstances under the care of a man thought to have murdered nearly 250 victims. His name? Harold Shipman, Dr. Death. The man known to history as Harold Shipman was born on Monday the 14th of January 1946 in Nottingham in the English Midlands. His mother was Vera Shipman, a homemaker, and his father was Harold Shipman Sr., a lorry driver. Both of Harold's parents were devout Methodists. This religious influence does not seem to have had any lasting impact on the younger Harold Shipman. Growing up, he was known to friends and family as Fred, from his middle name, Frederick, to avoid confusion between him and his father. He was the second child of the family and had an older sister, Pauline, who was his senior by 7 years. Harold was later joined by a younger brother, Clive, born 4 years after him. Vera Shipman developed a close relationship with her son soon after he was born. It was noted by those who knew the family that she was a controlling mother. She would choose his clothes and monitor the people he was associating with closely, even when he was well into his childhood and other boys his age had gained some independence. Throughout his school career, Shipman maintained few friendships, but to say that he was a misanthrope would be misleading. Records and contemporary accounts show that he enjoyed playing team sport and was a particular fan of football. He also excelled on the rugby pitch as a schoolboy. His sister would often accompany him to school dances. He had relatively few friends, though at the same time he was not particularly isolated. He was also seldom in trouble, never received a detention, and he performed relatively well in academic terms. The Shipmans, although hailing from a humble background, were social climbers. Both Harold and Vera had ambitions for their children that extended beyond the factory floor where Harold Sr. had worked for a large part of his career and the dour neighbourhood they inhabited. Neighbours later recalled that this gave the Shipmans a somewhat aloof air and attitude, thinking themselves above their community and already mentally existing in a more middle-class setting, despite their surroundings. The most formative experience of Harold's childhood was the illness and death of his mother, who contracted a terminal form of lung cancer when he was in his mid-teens. Other members of the family recalled how Harold would spend hours with his mother during her illness. He would rush back from school, go straight to her side, and remain there as long as he could. These moments were evidently of immense importance to both Vera and Harold, and allowed him to perfect a bedside manner which would come to play an important role in his future career as a doctor. Another impact of this experience was that Harold witnessed firsthand the sort of care that was administered by doctors visiting the home. Vera was caused immense pain by her condition, which was moderated by morphine, a form of opiate with a strong pain-killing effect. The drug would be administered and the pain that Vera was suffering would melt away and she would relax back into a state of comfort. It was noted, even at the time, that Shipman, firmly in his place by his mother's bedside whenever these drugs were administered, was fascinated by the effect that opiates had and the huge change they could have on a person enduring immense pain. He would later have an obsessive relationship with opiates, using them first on himself and then on his patients to devastating effect. Vera Shipman died from lung cancer at 43 years of age on the 21st of June 1963. It was from this moment onwards that Harold became determined to enter the medical profession, perhaps with the goal of figuring out why the doctors who had attended his mother during her illness were ultimately unable to save her life. While the exact reason for his interest in medicine can never be fully determined, they do seem to have been driven by this early experience of death in his immediate family. Vera died on a Friday. The following Monday, Shipman was back at school. His classmates were shocked to hear of his mother's death, but several of them later reflected that it did not appear to weigh heavily on Harold's mind. Indeed, it was only when he appeared in school on the day of her funeral wearing a black armband that his friends realized what had happened. He was emotionally distant from the matter, they recounted, and spoke about it as an inevitable event, one out of his control, and one from which he simply had to move on. 2 years later, in 1965, Shipman entered the medical school at the University of Leeds. This was after several earlier attempts, as his academic performance on previous tries had been under the required standard. He eventually made it in, a demonstration of his desire to become a doctor. Furthermore, he had also obtained a scholarship to attend at Leeds and had a small amount of money available to start a life of a kind in the Yorkshire city. Shipman started his course at Leeds in September 1965. It was soon noted by other students that he was aloof and haughty, displaying an arrogance which was not matched by his academic or medical ability. During his first year at medical school, Shipman met Primrose Oxterby, the woman who was to become his wife. Primrose had a strict and conservative upbringing, and she maintained habits and outfits which, in comparison to her peers, were old-fashioned. At the time she and Shipman met, Primrose was working as a window dresser, having left school with no qualifications. Whilst the circumstances of their first encounter are unknown, it is thought that they may have met on a bus ride into the centre of town, a route which they both commonly took. Shipman brought Primrose to a coffee shop for their first date, and the two appeared to hit it off right away. Shipman was soon introducing Primrose as his girlfriend and taking her to parties as a couple. Soon after, when Shipman was just after turning 20 and Primrose was 17, she fell pregnant. This was a time when having children out of wedlock was still considered problematic, and the pair quickly arranged a shotgun wedding at a registry office to ensure they were married when the child arrived. It was an understated and demure service. Primrose continued for a long time to live at home rather than in Shipman's student flat. Her parents disapproved of Shipman and the nature of Primrose's relationship with him, and he was prohibited from visiting their home. Shipman and his new wife were, therefore, confined to meeting one another in cafes and pubs. In 1967, Primrose gave birth to a baby girl who they named Sarah and moved in with Shipman, who only had his student loans and scholarship to support his young family. Medical school was therefore a stressful experience for Shipman. He had an intense and demanding home life, as well as difficult studies to contend with. Shipman was not as bright as many of his peers and needed to put in a greater number of hours to keep up. His decision not to live in student halls near the campus also meant that he had a long commute into the centre of town to attend lectures. This was far from the carefree student experience that many others were enjoying around him. Shipman's first position upon graduating and leaving Leeds was at Pontefract General Infirmary in the West Riding of the County of Yorkshire, where he was employed as a house officer, a position which we would now call a junior doctor role, on a residential placement. He remained in this post for the next 12 months, during which there were no reported incidents or misdemeanours. He also registered at this time as a doctor with the British General Medical Council. Shipman remained a senior house officer at the same hospital for a further 3 years, during which he gained further specialist qualifications in paediatrics and gynecology. During this period, Shipman and Primrose had another child, a boy named Christopher. Shipman's social routine remained very different to that of his peers. Many other young doctors, unencumbered with families, spent their evenings socializing and their weekends spending some of the money they had earned. Shipman had duties in the home, and any disposable income he had was spent on his young family. This isolated him from others in the hospital, and he failed to develop any close relationships with his colleagues. He was remembered chiefly as an overconfident, arrogant doctor who approached his work in a way which did not really reflect his limited amount of experience as a practicing physician. His son, Christopher, was born on the 21st of April 1971 in the same hospital where his father worked. The impact that having children made on his career and life were significantly limited by Primrose, who took on almost all domestic duties related to childcare and the management of the house. She also provided Shipman with unwavering support and a form of adoration, an approach towards her husband which she maintained even after his crimes were revealed many years later. They would have 2 further children in later years, another 2 boys, born in 1979 and 1982, whom they named David and Sam. Shipman started 1974 by applying for a new position at Abraham Ormerod Medical Centre in West Yorkshire. He was soon made a junior partner at the medical centre after a short probationary period. His colleagues were quite a lot older than him here, and his fresh face, recent training and charm were seen as assets. During his time at Abraham Ormerod, Shipman underwent a social change, developing a personality which was far more outgoing and professional. Almost every reclusive and antisocial aspect was gone. He also, however, became more aggressive and confrontational. His colleagues remember him as intolerant and sensitive. Shipman hated being corrected and would enjoy putting his colleagues down, reveling in their social embarrassment. One of the roles Shipman had at the medical centre was record-keeping and the management of the drugs cabinet, where expired medicines had to be removed and disposed of. He would remove those drugs which could no longer be used and restock the store with fresh supplies. In February 1975, Concerns were raised at the Home Office Drugs Inspectorate that large amounts of a drug known as pethidine were being acquired by Shipman. Pethidine is a synthetic opioid similar in nature and effect to morphine and was the most widely prescribed drug for the treatment of acute pain in Britain at the time. When taken recreationally, the drug reduces feelings of stress and can stimulate a mild sense of happiness. The recreational abuse of drugs by medical professionals was more common decades ago, when oversight of supplies within hospitals was less stringent. This could involve anyone from doctors and nurses to midwives or dentists who observed their calming effects and tried them themselves. In this regard, Shipman's actions were not entirely unheard of, but it was still a serious breach of conduct to abuse the responsibilities given to him in this way. He was clearly acquiring the drug to take himself. From the outside, it did not appear as though Shipman had an addiction. The only concerns about his use of drugs were raised over abnormalities in the medical storage records at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Center, rather than any alarming behavior on his part. His professional behavior, aside from occasionally being rude, was steady, and he was well regarded by most patients and colleagues. He was considered to be a controlling manager and was often dictatorial to nurses, some of whom appreciated the fact that he would take charge of administering injections, a task which would normally have been their responsibility. When investigations into this matter started, the pharmacists who supplied the drug to Shipman in his capacity at the medical center threw officers off the scent. Shipman was a professional, they were assured, an upstanding doctor who would be the last person to misuse these substances. Shipman had made sure to develop a good relationship with the supplier, and their statements to investigators from their perspective were entirely true. The facade that Shipman had presented to them was indeed that of a competent and moral medical professional. In reality, Shipman took the expired drugs at home recreationally. In one notable incident, his wife, Primrose, had to contact other doctors at the medical center, asking them for help when Shipman collapsed and hit his head hard on the bathroom sink. One of Shipman's suppliers eventually came forward and reported to authorities that an unusually large volume of opiates was being delivered to Shipman. This led investigators to interview him. Harold had his answers prepared, and the fact that he managed both the supply and removal of drugs in the medical center, as well as the records, meant that there was no paper evidence to suggest that abnormally large quantities of opiates were being delivered. Having encountered a brick wall, the authorities discontinued their search. However, after the authorities abandoned their inquiry, the managers of the medical center interviewed Shipman separately and accused him of illegally using opiates and covering his tracks by claiming he had simply dispensed with expired pethidine. Despite his denials, his position at the center was terminated. Before he left, Shipman had finally admitted his guilt, and the partners at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Center subsequently reported this admission to the authorities. The police interviewed Shipman not long afterwards, and he then checked into a drug rehabilitation center to avoid prosecution. In rehab, he came fully clean about his drug abuse and admitted that he had in fact been taking and abusing opiates, which he claimed was to help him combat the depression he experienced from his work at the medical center. In his notes, the officer who interviewed Shipman, Detective Sergeant George McKeating, noted that Shipman's veins had collapsed from the years of opiate abuse he had undergone. Shipman wrote a statement for the police in which he detailed the nature of his addiction, how he had obtained the drugs he consumed. He concluded this document by stating that he would never again enter a professional position in which he would have easy access to opiates and other drugs of this kind. He was consequently discharged from the rehabilitation centre on the 30th of December 1975 on the advice that he would receive continued psychiatric support. In February 1976, Shipman was brought before the Halifax Magistrates' Court on 3 charges of obtaining 10 ampoules of 100 mg pethidine by deception, 3 charges of illegal possession of pethidine, and 1 charge of forging a prescription, which was the principal way in which he obtained the drugs he used. He pleaded guilty to all of these charges, but was not imprisoned for any of them. Rather, the court ordered that he pay £75 on each charge. Thus, Shipman escaped with a grand total of a £600 fine. Even as his trial was underway in 1976, Shipman had already started out in a new medical position, this time at the Newton Aycliffe Health Centre in County Durham. His employers were aware of the ongoing legal proceedings against him, as well as his historic drug use, but he was well qualified in other ways, and with the NHS short of doctors in the 1970s, they decided to employ him anyway. They offered him the position on the condition that he continued to receive psychiatric help, and they assured the relevant authorities that he would not have access to any of the controlled drugs that the clinic held and which he had abused in the past. The General Medical Council, also aware of these legal proceedings, reviewed Shipman's case and decided that he did not need to be interviewed. His position as a registered doctor was safe. A short time later, Shipman applied for a new position as a general practitioner, GP, with the Donnybrook Medical Practice in Hyde, a town now located in Greater Manchester. Shipman was upfront about his previous experiences with substance abuse and indicated that he had sought professional help to deal with his addiction. He was offered the position on the grounds that he did not start taking drugs again. On the 1st of October 1977, Shipman started this position in Hyde. It was soon noted that he went above and beyond for his patients, showing them a level of care and attention which was unusual and welcome. He spent far longer than other GPs talking to those he was treating, asking them about their holistic health. He also showed a keen willingness to intervene to alleviate suffering and made a habit of performing home visits, which was a largely outdated practice in which a doctor would travel to the home of a patient to check in on them after their appointment. However, to many of his colleagues, Shipman remained arrogant, aloof, and difficult to get on with. To anyone looking on over the next decade and a half, Harold Shipman lived a fairly normal life. He worked at the Donnybrook Medical Centre in Hyde and raised his growing family with Primrose. He was a doctor who commanded a fair degree of respect in the local community. A few people might have been aware that he had previously been convicted of stealing expired drugs and forging documentation to do so back in the early 1970s, but those few who knew about this would have increasingly ignored it. This had happened a long time ago, and Shipman had been a young man at the time. If anything, he deserved to be praised for overcoming his addiction and getting his life back on track. For sure, there were people he worked with who still considered him aloof and arrogant. Several people noted years later that he was prone to being highly sarcastic towards staff members that were more junior than him, and conversely charming to those he needed to be on his best behaviour around, yet they didn't doubt that he was a competent and committed doctor. In his private life, Shipman and Primrose raised their family. Photos from the 1980s show them on holidays with their children around various parts of England, and they seemed like a fairly normal middle-class family. However, behind all of the facade, Shipman had already become one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. As we will see, nobody really knows how many deaths he was responsible for, but it must have extended into the hundreds, and was all going on surreptitiously over many years. Shipman might never have been caught had it not been for his actions in the 1990s. Late in 1991, Shipman left the practice at Hyde after nearly 15 years there. He had become angry in recent times over the new IT computer system which had been installed in 1989, and was also displeased about the fund-holding scheme which was introduced by the National Health Service, one which allowed practices to set their own budgets with government money. Shipman left to set up his own practice, which opened on New Year's Day of 1992. He took many of his patients with him, a move which caused considerable acrimony with his former colleagues in the process. Shipman even tempted a number of staff to leave Donnybrook and come and join him in his new practice. His popularity with those he treated meant that there was little doubt that he could get away with this, and he was not breaking any rules within the health profession to set up a rival medical centre. His new practice was well received by residents in Hyde, as well as regulators and other medical associations, leading him to be hailed, quote, "the best doctor in Hyde." Strangely, despite claiming the adoption of computers and the NHS fund-holding scheme were his main reasons for quitting the Donnybrook Centre at Hyde, Shipman soon introduced these to his new business. In 1993, he even became the local chairperson of the users group for a microdoc computer system that was being used by doctors and health professionals in the wider region. He joined the NHS fund-holding scheme in 1995. All of this made the reasons he had claimed he had left Donnybrook for seem less than sincere. Significantly, he was also not vetted about his previous conviction when he opened his private practice. West Pennine Health Authority seemingly overlooked his conviction back in the mid-1970s, and he was consequently allowed to open his own practice without any restrictions on his handling of opiates and other powerful drugs. It was during the late 1990s, several years after he went out on his own with an independent practice, that suspicions were first raised about Shipman. As part of the process of cremating or burying the deceased, several doctors from independent practices and organizations had to complete forms attesting to the nature and cause of death, as well as the state of the body. In Britain at the time, the doctor who was treating the deceased could not sign off on the forms him or herself. Instead, they needed a third-party doctor to do so. This was designed as a safeguarding mechanism, but it soon developed into a profitable side business as the third-party doctor was paid a fee for doing so, leading the process to become known euphemistically as cash for ash. In Shipman's case, one of these forms, Form C, was sent routinely by him to another medical practice for their completion, which was in fact located just over the road from his own. the volume of these forms sent to the Brook medical practice, and specifically to Dr. Linda Reynolds, a practitioner there, eventually raised eyebrows. There were an unusually high number of these for a practice the size of the one Shipman was operating. Concerns were soon raised with John Pollard, the district coroner for the Greater Manchester region. Shipman had, in the previous 3 months, sent over 16 Form Cs to the Brook practice. Of the patients involved, many had reportedly been in good health immediately prior to their deaths. Moreover, Shipman had almost always been in attendance during or just after the time of death. Another point of suspicion was that, as attested to in the report, those who had died had often been fully dressed, not dressed in the night clothes one would normally don at a time of illness if they were in bed or trying to remain comfortable while ill. With this strange set of events, investigations into Shipman's practice began. After he began receiving these worrying reports, John Pollard wrote and submitted his own report to the Greater Manchester Police. Yet the subsequent investigation, led by Chief Superintendent David Sykes and Detective Inspector David Smith, was a half-hearted, toothless affair which the police did not even request autopsy reports of the 2 most recently deceased individuals to have been reported dead from Shipman's practice. D.I. Smith also failed, because of an unchallenged clerical error, to realize that he was in fact investigating 31 deaths, not 20. Of the 20 he did look into, he only obtained medical records for 14, 13 of which were related to women who had died with no underlying conditions. Statistically speaking, it is incredibly unlikely that 13 out of 14 patients being treated by the same doctor would die in close proximity to one another without any underlying conditions. But Smith seemed unconcerned by this revelation. He eventually concluded that there was nothing suspicious about these deaths and that Shipman did not need to be investigated further. Shipman had not been interviewed, and his criminal record, showing historic substance abuse, was not accessed by the police as part of their inquiry. It would later be revealed that Smith had been primarily charged with investigating the case and was a relatively junior detective. He was not provided with adequate oversight by Sykes as the chief superintendent. Later, the inadequacies of their investigation were covered up, and the Commission of Inquiry was lied to by Smith. Had this first look at Shipman's crimes been properly pursued, several of his final victims might have survived. While the investigation by Smith and Sykes was a debacle, Shipman was running out of road anyway. On the 24th of June 1998, Kathleen Grundy, a patient of Shipman, died. She was aged 81 and had been a healthy, active and independent woman despite her advanced years. Grundy was a well-known and highly regarded member of her community. She had been mayor of Hyde years earlier and helped to run a pensioners' lunch club and other local societies. Indeed, the week before her death, she had been on a coach trip with several of her friends to Derbyshire, where she was reported to have been in her normal state of good health. Kathleen, on the day of her death, was expected at a social event with her friends. When she did not appear, 2 of her friends went to her house to check on her. Separately, another friend who was concerned made the journey to her home for the same purpose. These events show Kathleen as a popular and social member of the community. Her friends entered her home to find her dead on the sofa. They then called upon her doctor, Harold Shipman, to attend the scene. He pronounced her dead and even commented on what he believed had caused her death: cardiac arrest. Later, Shipman would recount far more vague causes of death to the police and to local authorities. Kathleen's death certificate, completed by Shipman, showed that she had, quote, died of old age, which many who knew her struggled to believe. Soon after her death, her daughter, Angela Woodruff, who also worked as an attorney, was shocked to read the contents of her mother's will. This had been changed just before her death to leave nearly all of her estate to her doctor, Harold Shipman, a sum totalling approximately £350,000. The two witnesses listed as present during the time of this change were other patients on Shipman's list. Woodruff was immediately suspicious and filed a police report. By this time, Angela had already met with Shipman. She described him as cold and standoffish, very unlike the friendly medical professional that her mother had often described him as being to her. On the 1st of August 1998, a police warrant to search Shipman's home and medical practice was issued. When police arrived, his typewriter and medical records were seized. Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed and a toxicology report was commissioned. It found that opiates were present in her body. On the 10th of August, police officers working on the investigation were informed that Shipman had previously illegally accessed and abused opiates. A forensic examination of Grundy's will showed that both it and her signature had been forged, likely using the same typewriter that the police had seized from Shipman's home. Her daughter, Angela, had already cited her concern about the validity of her mother's apparent will. It contained many spelling and grammatical mistakes, which was very out of character for Kathleen, who had always been meticulous in her writing. These facts identified, Shipman was arrested on the 7th of September on suspicion of causing the death of Kathleen Grundy. This sparked a wave of suspicion surrounding the earlier concerns highlighted by Dr. Reynolds, and soon all of the deaths reported by Shipman were being re-examined. As investigators began to widen the net of their suspicions, everything suddenly became open to doubt. Perhaps Shipman had not just simply tried to profit off the deaths of Kathleen Grundy and a few of his other patients in the 1990s. Maybe he had been responsible for the deaths of other patients of his years earlier. Soon it would even be asked what he had been doing with all of the powerful opiates he had been stealing back in the 1970s. Perhaps he had not been taking all of them himself. Perhaps he had been engaged in his sinister activity for many, many years. From the moment the body of Kathleen Grundy had been exhumed, Shipman evidently felt like he was coming under fire. He held a press conference just before the time of his arrest to plead his innocence, although only a small local newspaper made any sort of report on it. The matter split the community, with many refusing to believe that their kind, attentive doctor could have been involved in any such scandal. Under police interrogation, Shipman was asked about his patient, whom he described as an opium addict. Kathleen, according to his professional opinion, had died from an overdose. This was immediately met with doubt. This was an 81-year-old in good health, a former mayor of Hyde, and an active member of her community even in her early 80s. Nothing pointed to her being an opium addict so out of control that she could have overdosed. This desperate claim on Shipman's part probably reflects how desperate he felt in this situation. This was the first time in many years that Shipman's professional opinion had been challenged, and he was not used to being under fire. Now Shipman was charged with the murder of Kathleen Grundy. He was denied bail when he appeared before the court in Ashton-under-Lyne before he was returned to police custody. Members of the community back in Hyde were shocked. Their own well-respected community doctor had been hauled up on murder charges related to the death of a beloved member of their town. Police now began combing the death certificates of others whose deaths had been certified by Shipman over the years. They noticed that an unusually large number had been entered with natural causes or old age as the cause of death. These were lax and vague terms which should have been certified as legitimate by the presence of significant organ failure or another attendant cause. Thus, the prosecutors decided to charge Shipman with the murder of 15 patients, including Kathleen Grundy. These were all patients who had died recently in his care at his private practice in Hyde, though, as we will see, investigations about more historic crimes were also accelerating. The prosecution were most confident about obtaining a conviction on the basis of the more recent crimes for which the evidence was stronger. His trial began on the 5th of October 1999. Shipman pled not guilty to each of the charges. The case for the prosecution centered on the fact that of the 15 who had been killed, only one of them had actually been prescribed morphine. The fact that opiates had been present in the bodies of all victims was a cause of serious concern. The trial also highlighted the crassness of Shipman's killing spree. In one instance, it is likely that he killed his victim by injecting her with a lethal dose of opiates when a friend was present in the next room. Mary West, aged 81, was being visited by a friend, Marian Hadfield, during the time of Shipman's visit. Marian, on seeing Shipman and Marie speaking, waited for them to finish in the kitchen next to the living room where both were sitting. She recalled that the conversation, which she could hear faintly through the wall, came to a stop. Shipman, startled at seeing Marian, hastily uttered something about Marie suffering a stroke whilst he had been out collecting something from his car. The real cause of death, as uncovered during the inquest, was the injection of a lethal dose of heroin into her bloodstream. After 1 minute, the affected person would stop breathing, followed by death 5 minutes later, owing to lack of oxygen. This method of killing gave victims the appearance of having fallen into a deep sleep. As the trial developed, it was revealed that Shipman had obtained opiates in the same way that he had done so in his first practice. He would also issue false prescriptions as a basis for ordering more. He even prescribed morphine for several patients he had already killed. In one order, Shipman obtained 12,000 milligrams of morphine, enough to kill 360 people. Shipman continued to claim that his patients had died of natural causes: heart attacks, strokes, and sudden collapses. These claims were totally inconsistent with the condition in which the bodies were found at the inquest. The peaceful, restful condition of the bodies did not stack up with a claim of a massive trauma such as a heart attack, and further undermined his defense. His claim that 2 of his patients died of pneumonia were also ruled out, as no residue was left in the lungs, as would have been the case if this claim were true. Another of Shipman's characteristics, which was noted during his trial, was the fact that he was utterly remorseless. Not only did he continue to deny guilt in light of staggering evidence, he also spoke of his victims in a heartless way. When the case of one victim, Ivy Lomas, was raised, Shipman laughed, calling her a, quote, nuisance. He left her dead in a hospital bed before she was discovered. Upon discovering one of his victims, Shipman did not perform the routine demanded of medical professionals to correctly ascertain whether they were, in fact, dead. When Marion Hadfield interrupted Shipman's murder of her friend Marie, Shipman demonstrated that she was dead by pulling back her eyelids and gesturing to her pupils, telling Marion, quote, "See, there's no life there." Whenever a death occurred in the presence of others, Shipman would always claim that he had called an ambulance. The court inquiry, which accessed phone records as part of their investigation, found that no calls had ever been made. Witnesses who took the stand before the court also revealed Shipman's cruel habit of guilt-tripping the family members of his victims. To the daughter of one victim, 68-year-old Pamela Hillier, he snarled that she should have spent more time with her sick mother and that she should have been aware of her underlying health conditions, which of course she did not actually have. The final charge on which Shipman was accused in court was that of the forgery of Kathleen Grundy's will. Incredibly, the two witnesses he had recruited to certify the new will were his own patients, Paul Spencer and Claire Hutchinson, who had both been sitting in Shipman's waiting room at the time that he set about forging the document. Both noted that they had seen Grundy's signature on the document, and both attested that they were witnesses, although neither were told what the document was for before they signed it. Paul Spencer later stated in court that he believed the document was a medical one and had no idea he was signing off as a witness of a will. Grundy's signature on the will was forged. This was done very badly. In fact, what was most striking about the evidence presented against Shipman was how amateurish many aspects of his efforts to cover his tracks were. Later, a great many people would wonder how he had got away with what he was doing for so long, given his rather pathetic methods of covering up his crimes. Shipman's fingerprints were also found to be all over the will, far more than would have been the case had he simply been asked to sign it. Conversely, the defense he mounted was weak. In response to the charge that he had murdered his victims through the delivery of opiates, he simply said that he had a bad habit of over-administering drugs. He also said that the reason Kathleen Grundy's will had been written on his typewriter was because he had loaned it to her. Given that this was all he could muster by way of a defense, it is no surprise that on the 31st of January 2000, Harold Shipman was found guilty on all 15 counts of murder and one of forgery. He was sentenced to 15 life sentences. From the evidence that was introduced before and during the trial, it was clear that a great deal more information was yet to be uncovered about Shipman. The Secretary of State for Health, Alan Milburn, commissioned the Laming Inquiry, led by Lord Laming of Tewin, to investigate. The scope of the investigation was limited, and a public outcry was soon raised. The key question that the public demanded an answer to was how a medical professional working for a state health system was permitted to remain in practice for so long, despite his criminal record. They also demanded reassurance that they would be protected from such a doctor in the future. The government initially held fast to the commission they had instigated, but caved under the weight of public pressure and a legal challenge which had been issued by the victims' families and 9 media organisations. On the 31st of January 2001, exactly 1 year after Harold Shipman had been sentenced, the Shipman Inquiry was set up, this time as a public inquiry with wide-ranging statutory powers, led by Dame Janet Smith. The inquiry was faced with a massive task. An enormous 888 cases that Shipman could have been involved in as possible murders were to be examined for evidence, 493 of which had to be thoroughly investigated. 2,311 police statements were reviewed, as well as coroner's reports, medical records, practice documents and computer records. The inquiry was also immensely public, given the scope of international interest in the case. Cameras were installed in the chamber where the inquiry was being conducted, and the media were given special facilities to allow them to report on all phases of it. The Hyde Public Library, based in the town where Shipman had practiced medicine for over 20 years, hosted a live stream of the inquiry, giving residents the opportunity to watch events unfold. Shipman did not attend the inquiry and refused to appear before it. The only threat which could be made to compel him to attend was that of additional prison time, but since he was already serving a whole-of-life sentence, this was an ineffective means of coercing him into appearing before it. The inquiry linked 215 deaths to Shipman, in which he was, quote, almost certainly responsible. This inquiry looked over the death records of those who had died under the direct or indirect care of Shipman, going all the way back to the 1970s, when he had worked at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Centre, and then after he started at the Donnybrook Medical Centre in Hyde. The case of every patient who had died that Shipman had been involved in the care of was re-examined in order to determine whether or not they had been killed according to Shipman's general modus operandi. The inquiry also considered evidence from witnesses who came forward, including the family members of potential victims and former colleagues of Shipman's over the years. Worrying patterns soon emerged. Often, Shipman was recorded as having been the only person present during the death of a patient, an immediate red flag for the inquiry. In general terms, Shipman was found to have been present at a far greater number of deaths than would be usual for a busy ward doctor. It was recalled by many who worked with him that he was rarely called to a death, but he was, nonetheless, present at a large number of them. It is also certain that in numerous cases considered by the inquiry, Shipman had altered the medical notes that accompanied the declaration. Unfortunately, though, a large proportion of the deaths in question had happened so many years before that hard evidence could not be provided to confirm that Shipman had killed a given victim. Instead, the inquiry had to speculate, based on circumstantial evidence that was 20 to 25 years old in some instances. Soon, a more complete picture began to emerge about what Shipman had done. The earliest killing that could be concretely attributed to him was that of Eva Lyons, which he committed when working at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Centre in Todmorden. On the 17th of March 1975, Shipman conducted a home visit during which he injected a substance into the back of Lyons' hand. Her husband stated at the time to his daughter that he had believed Shipman had helped Mrs. Lyons on her way. It is possible that Shipman had tested his method of killing on another former patient, Professor Elaine Oswald. She had been aged 25 back in the mid-1970s when she had attended Shipman for pain relief. She barely survived an opiate injection. At the time, Oswald believed that Shipman had resuscitated her, but 25 years later she came to the conclusion that she had narrowly escaped being one of his first victims because her body fought off the overdose. The inquiry did not link any deaths to Shipman during the time that he had briefly worked in the Newton Aycliffe Healthcare Centre while he was under investigation for stealing medical supplies from Abraham Ormerod. However, once he arrived to Donnybrook, a few months later, the opportunity to begin a killing spree once again suggested itself. His first victim in this phase of his life was Sarah Marsland, an 86-year-old woman, on the 7th of August 1978. This killing set the pattern for his murders for the remainder of his killing career. He made an unannounced home visit to the victim as her doctor, despite the fact that Sarah was fit, healthy, and did not present any substantive medical issues. He was present at the death and claimed that the cause of death was a heart attack. In 1978, he conducted 3 further killings and was linked to 4 further suspicious deaths. As these revelations were made through the inquiry, it became clear to those who knew him over the years that Shipman's home visits were not the actions of a committed doctor, but were those of a serial killer who wished to operate away from the prying eyes of other staff at the medical centre. And even at this, it was concluded that the number of murders he committed while working at Donnybrook was limited by his lack of ready access to opiates. Alice Gorton, 76, was the next killing attributed to Shipman. During his home visit to treat her for severe psoriasis, a skin condition caused by an autoimmune deficiency, on the 9th of August 1979, Shipman administered an overdose of opiates. He then travelled to the home of Gorton's daughter, telling her that her mother was very ill and that she should follow him immediately. Upon arriving back in Alice's home, Shipman informed Gorton's daughter that her mother was dead and that there was no need for a post-mortem. A loud groan from Alice's bedroom was a shock, showing that she was still alive. She died 24 hours later and did not recover enough to tell of her experiences. Shipman also killed Jack Shelmerdine in 1979, administering morphine which led to his death 30 hours later. During the following year of 1980, Shipman appears not to have claimed any further victims. The spree resumed on the 18th of April 1981, when May Slater, 84, was killed in her nursing home. He distracted the attending supervisor at the home by sending her to speak with the family, leaving him alone in May's room, where he injected her with a lethal dose of drugs. He called the supervisor back into the room soon afterwards and instructed her to inform the family that May had died. In several of his killings during 1984, there was a suggestion that Shipman had left bodies in a condition which would make it harder to determine the time and cause of death. In the murder of Dorothy Tucker, for instance, Shipman, having killed his victim through an injected opiate, turned up the temperature of the central heating, meaning that the internal temperature of the corpse would decline more slowly, one measure used to determine the time of death and which would increase the rate at which opiates in the body would break down. Shipman planned not only the killing, but the way he would use conditions to protect his identity and prevent blame. Throughout the 1980s, Shipman became ever more audacious, evidently feeling a greater sense of invulnerability with each murder he got away with. In 1986, he killed 2 women who lived on the same street and who employed the same housekeeper. As he predicted, whilst his presence was noted at the time of death of both victims, the alarm was not raised, nor were concerns expressed to anyone else. On and on it went. Eventually, the inquiry concluded that Shipman could have killed hundreds of people. John Pollard, the district coroner for the Greater Manchester region, who was one of the first to raise the flag about Shipman's actions in the period leading up to his arrest, believed that Shipman could have been responsible for upwards of 1,000 deaths. This is probably excessive. Shipman could have killed well over 100 people early on in his career when he had ready access to large amounts of opiates, but he was evidently under too great a level of supervision when he worked at the Donnybrook practice between the late 1970s and early 1990s to have been as prolific a serial killer there. Evidently, it was in order to extricate himself from close supervision there, not anything to do with their computer system, that he left in 1991. Within weeks of setting up his own practice at the start of 1992, he began a new killing spree. From 1993, a new pattern emerged in Shipman's methodology. He would murder a patient and, the day after their death, fill out a form for a prescription of 30 milligrams of diamorphine in the name of the victim. This would replenish the stock of opiates he had used in killing his victim, while also suggesting that the person had overdosed on their prescription if anyone looked into it. Shipman was incredibly sloppy about this at times. In the case of Mary Smith, in August 1993, he was nearly discovered when the victim's daughters walked in on him, and he stopped his murderous activities for a short time thereafter, apparently fearing that his pattern had been identified. In 1997, Shipman performed his most terrible spree of killing, murdering 37 people. 1998 was the year in which he performed his final set of killings. In mapping Shipman's murders during the inquiry, there was the concern raised that this spree had started when Shipman was working at the Pontefract General Infirmary, his very first job after medical school. This suspicion was raised further when a woman, then a student nurse working alongside Shipman, told the inquiry that when she had worked at Pontefract, there had been a great number of unexplained patient deaths which had upset her. This, she now realized, may have been linked to the fact that Shipman was working at the hospital during this period. The inquiry agreed that they should take a closer look at this period of time, and suspicions were raised in an astonishing 133 cases. As part of this investigation, other staff members from the PGI were interviewed by the inquiry. They attested that Shipman had maintained much the same character as was later reported. He was aloof, sometimes insufferable and superior, but very popular with patients. Another side of him was emphasized, however. Several other doctors recalled that he had a reckless attitude when administering drugs and opiates, which would sometimes lead him to administer them well in excess of safe levels. 3 deaths during this time were then linked to Shipman, in which it was concluded that the patient had died because of his sheer recklessness. However, following further analysis, it was claimed that these deaths were in fact probably natural. The deaths ascribed to Shipman range in certainty, from those he was convicted of killing on the basis of the weight of evidence overcoming his plea of not guilty, in other words, those that he almost certainly did commit, to others which were suspicious and linked in some way to him, but cannot be confirmed as his victims. This means that the number given in estimation of Shipman's total victim count ranges very broadly, with the most conservative figure being 218 people over a period of 30 years. It could have run up to 500 or 600 and beyond. Given the scale and scope of Shipman's crimes, it is common to ask why he acted as he did. A lot of suggestions made ignore the fact that Shipman's behaviour was fundamentally illogical and unreasonable, and attempts to try and reason why he did what he did are ultimately futile. However, there are some perspectives which might be worth considering, even if just for the purpose of examining the sort of mental state Shipman may have entered during his younger adult years onwards. We know, for instance, that Shipman did not boast of the lives that he had taken, and generally stayed well away from subsequent inquiries and investigations which demanded his presence. This suggests that he did not undertake these killings for some want of infamy. Indeed, Shipman continued to deny his involvement or guilt until he died in 2004. Many have argued that the death of his mother, Vera Shipman, was a great influence in his character development and state of mind. The main claim made by theorists of this school is that Shipman had a fascination with the effect that opiates had on his mother once administered to her when she suffered with terrible pain. The agony she experienced was quickly alleviated, and she relaxed soon after the injection was performed. Others have doubted that this was the case. Whilst some of Shipman's victims also suffered in pain with terminal illnesses, many others did not, and a large number of his victims were apparently well and healthy at the time they were killed. The alternative suggestion offered is that some of Shipman's victims were those who were terminally ill merely because this would be an easy way for him to explain their deaths afterwards. Another peculiar school of thought has claimed that Shipman rationalized his actions as someone who was killing patients who were near death anyway and who had become a burden on the health system. This claim has little merit. Then there was his own narcotic abuse. While it later became clear that Shipman had used many of the drugs he stole to carry out his murders, he had been taking them himself as well at various points. His drug addiction added to his lack of self-control and fueled his impulsive personality. This is a set of characteristics common amongst other serial killers, who describe in their own testimonies how they were not able to stop themselves once they had started a spree. A notable incident was when Shipman once asked one of his nurses if she felt a buzz when finding a patient dead, which might suggest that this was a high he experienced from killing, with parallels to addiction. The forged will, which was ultimately a great step toward finding and arresting Shipman, is an evident suggestion of a financial motive in the killing of his victims. Several families reported that they had valuable possessions removed from their homes after Shipman had performed his deadly work, although after his apprehension, only one item of jewellery was identified as belonging to a victim, and he did not display the same level of interest in acquiring mementos of his victims as is common in many other serial killers. Harold Shipman died on the 13th of January 2004 at 57 years of age. He was found hanging from the ceiling of his cell at Her Majesty's Prison Wakefield, where he was pronounced dead at 8:10 a.m. in the morning. His bedclothes have been used to produce a noose, and he left no note. His wife, Primrose, remained loyal to her husband throughout her life, and, in the aftermath of his trial, was granted a new identity for her own protection. One report suggests that just before his death, Shipman received a letter from Primrose in which she demanded that he tell her the truth, suggesting that her unquestioning support for her husband had waned in the end. If true, this may be a factor in him taking his own life. The loss of his only remaining supporter. His death, lack of engagement with the judicial process and explanation left the families of the victims without closure, and a reason why their loved ones had suffered at his hands. Another suggestion is that he took his own life at that time in order that his wife could receive an NHS pension. Primrose Shipman received a full NHS pension, which she would not have been entitled to if Shipman had lived past the age of 60. It is unclear what has happened to Harold Shipman's family. Primrose and her children were given new, secret identities after the trial was concluded, in order to give them some level of security and privacy given the enormous public attention which surrounded the case of Britain's worst serial killer at the turn of the century. Harold Shipman was born and grew up in a relatively normal home environment in Nottingham in the 1950s and 1960s. The most dramatic element of his childhood was his mother's illness and death, something which inspired him to become a doctor and possibly influenced his later actions. Even while he was studying as a young man, there were red flags surrounding many of his actions. These were ignored, as were so many other warning signs in the years that followed. Eventually, he became a full doctor and soon began his campaign of secretive murder. The exact scale of his murderous actions remains debated, though inquiries over the years have concluded that he may have killed in excess of 200 patients. His motives have been a source of endless speculation as well. Perhaps more important than understanding the motives of Shipman is trying to dissect the immense structural failings which allowed him to access, kill, and work with patients for so long after serious concerns were raised. There was an incredible lack of oversight from the National Health Service and the Department of Health to monitor the number of deaths that were being reported by individual practitioners, which would have been a clear indication of something seriously wrong. The idea that doctors could be trusted on their honour, and that they were people for whom oversight and checks and balances were not necessary, allowed serious issues to be ignored in Shipman's case. Unwittingly, this contributed to the suffering of thousands of people. That law enforcement processes were so lackluster, investigations so quickly concluded, and so many concerns from patients and families ignored, speaks to a contemporary culture in which medical professionals were lauded over their patients and clients. The view that the doctor is always right, and the infantilization of those who raised concerns and fears, totally legitimately and correctly, led to many deaths which could have been prevented. Inattention, a mistrust of patients and families, and a reluctance to get involved with a doctor who was generally well regarded led to a culture of silence from officials and overseers who had the power to stop Shipman's murder sprees. What do you think of Harold Shipman? Do you think the focus should be on Shipman the man, his motives and reasons for killing, or on the systems and structures which enabled him to continue his deadly actions for so many years, long after red flags had repeatedly been raised about his conduct? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, Thank you very much for watching.